Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third guest lecture series in AttackIQ Academy's learning process and learning series. It's a great pleasure to welcome today Siobhan Gorman. Hi, Siobhan.
Hi, great to be with you.
Thanks for coming on board. So, for those of you that have joined, I imagine you've read a little bit about Siobhan, but I thought by way of introduction, I'd tell you a little bit more about my experience with her. So Siobhan is really one of the most impressive people working at the nexus of cybersecurity and public affairs, and it's an especial honor to have her here today. I first heard of Siobhan in, I think it was 2010, 2011, but I might be wrong, from Chris Finan, who's a former White House staffer in the National Security Council, and he met her. I think he must have been talking to Siobhan about cyber legislation. Is that right? Do you remember
Yeah,
Siobhan?
exactly
Yep.
what it was.
And so I think I was a younger, less experienced person then, and I was learning about the media. And Chris told me that she was one of the smartest reporters covering cyber in the United States, which is kind of a phrase that you don't forget, particularly because she was at the Wall Street Journal, which is also an unforgettable thing. And then another friend of mine, and he doesn't know that I'm telling you this, but he was from the Pentagon days, an author and journalist named Patrick Radden Keefe referred to her as the real deal, which now that I've gotten to know Siobhan since then, is 100% true. She's had an incredible career as a reporter. She was really one of the first people amongst a very small group to write about cybersecurity as a beat for a global paper, which, if you think about it historically, is an important distinction. She's now a partner at the Brunswick Group, where she advises clients on a wide range of cyber topics, from security to crisis management to ransomware negotiations. And she continues to write, which is good for all of us, good for all of you, good for everyone in the world. She had this great thing that she wrote at Brunswick, Eye on Cyber, when she first joined, and I remember reading it quite a bit and being impressed. And she does regular writing and publishing through Brunswick and media channels, and you can keep tracking it. And she's also really a public servant. Right now, she's in addition to her role at Brunswick and otherwise, she's a senior advisor to Harvard's Defending Digital Democracy Program, or D3P as it's known. And it is the most impressive and important non-governmental initiative in the US and probably the world on elections and cybersecurity. It brought together over the last, how many years, Siobhan? 4 years, probably?
Three actually. It was
Three.
2017 or so.
Yeah. It's brought together all the key stakeholders from technology, government, and all the secretaries of state to make change in election security, including by producing content, a playbook for crisis management. I think that was the one she worked on. She'll tell us about it, which she drafted, and now they're about to launch a playbook or a manual on disinformation in about a week, assuming nothing goes wrong with that, which I'm sure won't. But she's had a remarkable impact in the field, and it's a tremendous honor to have her join us. Thanks, Siobhan. Thank you again.
Thank you. That's you're hired for my PR, that's for sure. Thank you.
Great. I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd start with just a question about you. So how did you get into cybersecurity, and what were the questions that spurred your interest in it?
Well, that dates back to when I was a reporter, and actually at the time, I want to say it was 2005 or 2006. I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and when I joined the Baltimore Sun, I was covering intelligence issues, and they told me, well, you're going to have to cover the National Security Agency because it's in our backyard. Among other things, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper at the time lived in a neighborhood with a lot of NSA officials, and he loved having gossip about the Baltimore Sun's coverage of NSA. He loved hearing it. He wanted to talk about it at block parties and things like that. And so, I spent about half my time when I was at the Sun covering the National Security Agency. At the time, it suddenly was thrust into the news because there was a huge counterterrorism program, which was kind of known in various ways, but it was essentially a warrantless wiretapping program. That was a huge deal. But in the meantime, the NSA was also quietly, because that's how they operate in general, working on what would become the National Comprehensive Cybersecurity Initiative, which was like the first major government push, perhaps in the world, but certainly in the US, on cybersecurity. And I had caught wind of this. And, I mean, obviously the NSA, its raison d'etre in many ways is cybersecurity. It just wasn't known as, it was called information assurance, I guess, at the time, which is, kind of, I guess, sufficiently bland. But it rebranded, so to speak, as cybersecurity, kind of in the late sort of 2008, 2009 timeframe. And so I started to cover cybersecurity just as part of my coverage of NSA. And then that made me sort of an early entrant to the process, just because no one else really cared about it at that time. And not that many people even really cared about the NSA. But when I moved over to the Wall Street Journal, I said, well, I think I'd like to cover cybersecurity in addition to the CIA and, all the other counterterrorism stuff I was doing. And they said, yeah, that was kind of one of the reasons why we wanted to hire you, because we thought that you sort of understood this tech stuff and we don't really understand it, but we're also not really convinced it's relevant to a business office, or business audience, so prove it. And so I said, all right. And I spent basically all of 2008 trying to demonstrate to my editors that cybersecurity was relevant for a business audience. And I finally was able to break through in like early 2009 with a story talking about Chinese and Russian sort of cyber spies leaving behind sort of little logic bombs in the electric grid. And that was sort of sufficiently real to people that they were like, okay, well, this is a thing. Like if the electric grid goes down, that'll be a problem and that'll be a physical consequence. It's not just ones and zeros. And so that sort of gave me license within the paper to write more on cybersecurity. And interestingly enough, it got to a point within a year or so where I said, guys, I have other things I need to cover too. So we really need a reporter who is just covering cybersecurity. And they said, we think you're right. And they created that position. And so that was someone who I worked with closely, but he covered kind of the corporate side of it. And then I would cover the national security side. And I mean, since then, it's, the Wall Street Journal now has a whole vertical on cybersecurity. I saw no benefit from that directly, by the way, but they do a great job. And so, that was sort of my backwards way of getting into cybersecurity. I moved over to the Brunswick group in 2015 to help them build out the cybersecurity and privacy practice, which I co-lead with two great partners. And that was sort of the trajectory.
So we owe it all to an editor who was gossiping about with his NSA neighbors as the origin story. That's really cool. Well, we're all familiar with the Wall Street Journal. This is a thing that I think people have heard of. Brunswick is globally recognized and incredibly impressive, but could you tell us a little bit more about it and what you do there?
Oh, of course. Yeah. And it's not actually as well known in the United States. It's based in London and we have offices around the world. It's 23 offices in 14 countries. Obviously the United States being one where we have 5 offices, including in Washington, DC, which is not exactly where I'm sitting because I'm obviously at home, but I'm not that far from my office. And Brunswick is a strategic advisory firm that primarily focuses on reputational sort of consequences and business risk decisions. Some would call it a strategic communications firm. It's actually a little bit broader than that in terms of kind of a hybrid of business consulting and communications. But that's kind of the broader swath of what Brunswick focuses on. And we were actually started as more of a specialist in financial communications, but it's extended well out from there. And as you were kind enough to mention, I mean, I focus on cybersecurity. I also work with companies on broader crisis issues and public affairs sort of policy issues as well. And in the cyber practice, we work with companies basically helping to mitigate risk to their reputation. And that may mean that they're trying to prepare in advance for the fact that they may have some sort of cyber crisis in the future. Given what we're seeing now, that's a pretty good bet for most companies. And so we would help them, come up with playbooks or do simulations or educate their employees about cybersecurity, or the playbook is sort of how you'd respond in the event of a cyber attack. On the communication side. We then help them obviously with, if they're in the middle of an event, we help them on the communications front, communicating with whichever stakeholders are relevant there. And then we also work with companies to position themselves on cybersecurity issues. It could be a cybersecurity company that's looking to sort of carve out its niche and sort of have people understand how it's differentiated, or it could be a company in pretty much any sector that wants to carve out a leadership position on cybersecurity. cybersecurity, or it's a company that has a really important policy issue that
Hmm.
intersects with technology and security issues, and will help them sort of position themselves on that.
Yeah, it's such a cool company. I've gotten to know a number of your colleagues in the last 6 months. Ash Spiegelberger, who heads the San Francisco office, and Karen Wickery, who's written this great book about how introverts can network. I think it's called Taking the Work Out of Networking or something. It's a great title, great book. I definitely listened to it before I met with her. And then George Little, our friend George Little, who was the Pentagon press secretary, and just such a funny, brilliant person. So you've got amazing colleagues, right? It's
Yeah, George and I actually started at Brunswick at roughly the same time. I'd like to say that they actually made a coordinated effort because they were recruiting both of us to help build the cyber practice, but it wasn't actually coordinated. It was a soon-to-be colleague, frankly, of both of ours, who pointed out that at the time, well, at the time, I guess technically he was doing public affairs for Booz Allen, but right before that, he had been at the Pentagon and at the CIA as the press person. Obviously, those were things I covered as a journalist. And so our colleague said, you might want to make sure that they don't hate each other before you try to hire them and have them do something together. So actually, they gave us the heads up that this other person was somebody who they were looking at. And we got along quite well. And he was someone who I certainly trusted when I was a journalist. And so we actually went out to dinner and made a pact saying, okay, we're both going to join.
That's awesome. So for listeners who don't know George Little, check him out. You've got Siobhan here, so you're already like listening to her. But I believe he was the press secretary during the Bin Laden raid.
Yeah.
And so he and Jeremy Bash were the two people who Leon Panetta brought over to the Pentagon after Panetta sort of had this great moment of victory for the country and leading that and overseeing that operation. So the other thing I'll say about Brunswick that's really cool is they produce, I forget the name of the publication.
Brunswick Review.
Brunswick Review. Yeah, gosh, I was waiting to meet with Ash, and there's like the 7 or 8 editions of it sitting on the coffee table, and I thought, okay, great, here's another piece of marketing, by a public affairs firm. And I flipped through it, and actually I think I pocketed it because it was so good. I think I walked away with it. I think I told Ash, I was like, I'm taking this one home. Really good, like good writing, and just a super impressive firm. So could you, Siobhan, now you've been doing a lot on ransomware, which it's interesting. Like I think when you got started, we could have imagined ransomware potentially in 2008, but it's this thing that like emerged and is now such a big deal. Could you talk a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned from working on this issue at Brunswick?
Sure. And, just as context, because it's interesting, you use the word ransomware, and I don't know that people have fully internalized what that ends up meaning if you're running a company. But if you're at a company that's hit with ransomware, it will mean that often it'll come in and it'll just encrypt, it'll brick certain parts of your, either servers or parts of your network or what have you, and it will wipe out functionality for whatever part it's hitting. And that may affect operations, that may affect sort of more the corporate side, kind of administrative stuff, but often it'll knock out email. And, if we all think about how much we use email, think about not being able to have access to your email for 5 days. And
That sounds awesome. That sounds great to me.
I know at some level it sounds like a vacation, but if say you're right before earnings, that's like not great. And so, companies are increasingly, it's really been a very depressing surge as we all head into the kind of remote work zone where obviously you are and I am. And it's really, really tough for these companies to function, because what the initially ransomware was, they'd come, they'd lock down your stuff, and then they'd say, pay us money. And it wasn't even that much money initially. It'd be like, pay us $20,000 in Bitcoin and we'll undo it. And you saw a lot of this a few years ago against hospitals, which is not great, right? But they were targeting places that, would be incentivized to pay to get operations back up and running, and might not have great cybersecurity. And we've seen it just explode, especially lately, both in terms of just kind of the overall volume, and then also the techniques. Like, they'll come in and they'll lock your stuff down and they'll steal data. And then what they'll say is, you got to pay us to unlock your systems, but even if you think you can restore from backup, we've got all this data and we're going to post it online and embarrass you and create all kinds of problems if you don't pay up. And so that creates a huge dilemma for companies. And if they haven't thought about it in advance, it's really, really tough to do in the moment. So a few quick lessons. One, preparation is really key. And this is not only preparation for the operational side of, can we really restore from backup, and what's our business continuity plan, but it's also on sort of the communication side, because if they go after a server and all of a sudden you can't interact properly with, say, your customers, they're going to figure that out in a hurry. And if you don't think in advance and prepare in advance for how it is that you're also going to communicate with them, and how upfront you're going to be and sort of what that's going to look like, it's very difficult to kind of come up with on the fly, especially because you would be doing it also at a time that you're trying to figure out, are we going to negotiate with these guys? What's the strategy for that? Is it we're negotiating because we want to buy time? We're negotiating because we want to bring the price down, but we plan to pay? We're negotiating because we're trying to gather information, sort of figure out what we want to do. So that final piece around negotiations, I guess the third lesson, in addition to, figure out your operational backup plan, figure out sort of your communications response ahead of time. The third one would be, think ahead of time about what your policy is really going to be when it comes to negotiating with hackers, because some companies just have a flat policy of, we're not going to do it. Others don't really have any policy and haven't thought about it. And then you're kind of in a world of hurt, because there are a lot of different factors to weigh. Even if you want to pay, how do you get the money? Because they're always asking in Bitcoin, there are certain channels and all that kind of stuff. And so if they're asking for the equivalent of, I don't know, $40 million in Bitcoin, which I've seen, haven't seen anyone pay that yet, but I've certainly seen it be asked. Where would you get all that, even if you had that money in, say, dollars?
Wow, this is great. So let's dig in on this for a couple of minutes. It's fascinating. And then the one thing I would add, as you thought about this, is like, I actually began to feel stress on behalf of the people who were at the center of this. Like, because you can imagine, like, their bosses are calling, the board's calling, their phones are blowing up, emails are blowing up, and those
emails
people
may
are
not
stressed.
be blowing up, actually.
Right. Yeah. So sure. Yeah. Right. Emails are doing the opposite of blowing up. So that's just immensely stressful, and like obviously no one wants to go through that. There's this interesting theory, like cyber, climate, and obviously now pandemic disease. These are things that, like, they feel abstract to people until they don't. So one question I have for you is, as you talk about the advanced planning problem, for such a hard problem, you can imagine some people would want to just avoid it and like not do it. So what is the advice that you would give to a chief information security officer, or to anyone who's interfacing with their team or their board, to try and do this planning process?
Well, I get one way that you could do it is go ahead and do a simulation where it's a ransomware attack, and everybody starts to see what happens, and they realize how many sort of connections are challenged when you are dealing with a ransom attack. It can be, and how much it is also further challenged when everyone's remote. Because if you're thinking about the technical response to things, especially, they're used to being in a SOC. They're used to being in places where you can kind of turn around and talk to somebody. You can't do that right now, and you certainly can't count on being able to do it. Even if, say, you're like, well, for a real crisis, we'd all go in to work or what have you. You can't count on the fact that that's always going to be an option. And so I think that the advice would be to, frankly, scare them. You've got to make it feel real to people, right? This is something I learned as a journalist. I spent a year trying to persuade my editors that cybersecurity was real. And it's a matter of, in that case, coming up with the story that demonstrates it's real. I think that for executives that either just have other priorities, or they haven't given it that much thought, or they still think of it as pretty theoretical, I would offer a simulation, and I would also start offering up some examples of the companies that are being affected by these. I mean, there are some certainly that are in the news. There are a lot that are not, right? And hopefully the companies that we work with, usually the goal is not to have major news stories, even if for some reason, sometimes these ransom guys are doing their own PR, if you will. They're publishing this stuff online, they're promoting it, they're framing it in certain ways. You can't necessarily avoid it becoming public, but you can make sure that people understand that you're dealing with it.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm so curious about what they've written and how they've done that. Like, just from an adversary thinking about standpoint, that's that sounds like a rich thing to dive into. Have you seen companies as ransomware attacks have increased? Have you seen more and more people doing this and less resistance to preparations like what you've talked about?
Well, there's no resistance after someone's gone through one of these. It's very interesting because I had one client where the CEO wanted to be on every call because he wanted to know, well, what are the different ways this could play out? What are the factors here? What typically happens, and all of that. I'm not sure, but I would guess that 2 weeks prior to the event, he might not have been nearly as interested.
Yes.
So people get religion when they have to go through it. Absent that, it can be very hard because, CEOs especially are incredibly busy people. But I think that, and this is kind of, part of the work that you do, obviously you guys operate in the simulation world as well. But having people understand sort of how cyber risk fits into the broader business risk equation, I think is really important. And to get back to actually one of the previous questions you asked about CISOs actually explaining sort of what the issue is, if you could talk to others in the C-suite about, kind of how cyber risk compares vis-a-vis the other kinds of risk, regulatory, whatever, that they're looking at, and some of the costs associated with it. And frankly, you could even just look at amounts being paid to some of these hackers, but that's only a part of what the ultimate cost is. The cost of getting your stuff back online, the cost of lost productivity, the cost of lost sales, and the cost to your reputation too. If it's seen that you're not handling it well, there are, it can affect your stock price. It can also mean that people lose their job. Just talk to the former CEO of Equifax, the former CISO of Equifax. Like, these are not sort of cost-free situations.
Yeah, one of the things that I've adopted from Michelle Flournoy, who I worked with in the Pentagon, was she likes to say, and I think she started in the strategy office when she was starting in national security. I could be wrong about that, but she says you always have to give the future a seat at the table. And I think ransomware is one thing, and it's actually in the headline, so it might be easier if you're a risk manager to sort of pitch it forward to be like, this is the thing, look, this could happen to us. But I liked your point about bundling it within the broader areas of risk and compliance. So if you have a strategy process for managing risk, you could sort of identify a number of different things, and that might be a good way to do it. One thing that you mentioned that I'm super curious about that I haven't thought about at all is the idea that Bitcoin is so central to the ransomware process. So how does the world look at the Bitcoin community in relation to the ransomware problems that we see and proliferating so badly right now?
It's interesting you say that because we actually, a little while ago, we were working with a company that was part of the sort of Bitcoin blockchain infrastructure. And at the time, the biggest challenge that we were facing was how do you make it clear that this just isn't sort of like the infrastructure that criminals use and like it's just sort of this like dark, deep place that no one can track. The interesting thing about Bitcoin is that, and my background isn't a technical background, but my understanding is that actually, in some ways, Bitcoin and kind of blockchain, the infrastructure it rides on, provide a little bit, in some cases, opportunities for actually tracking it a little bit better. But there is definitely a sense among, the criminal world in the cyberspace, and to some degree, it's true that Bitcoin is not nearly as traceable, and sometimes maybe they'll, use other currencies or something as well. And so, Bitcoin ends up being quite integral because it's just the currency that these guys seem to rely on. And most major companies, and frankly, actually most companies in general, don't necessarily think of Bitcoin or how to get it or anything like that as something that they really need to deal with at all. And we were working with one large company that was, the kind of company that probably in most cases would definitely not be paying ransoms to things, but definitely wanted to make sure that it was an option, right? If for some reason this was really shutting down operations, you really needed to go, that you would have that option. And so they looked at, what are the different ways in which you can do it? Well, you can buy a lot of Bitcoin and have it. And I remember their CFO saying, well, guys, this isn't an investment strategy. So like, let's not think about it that way.
So interesting. Yeah.
And I think ultimately what they decided to do, there are a lot of these third parties that will basically, it's like an exchange, force that can basically translate cash into Bitcoin easily. Because the other thing was that people were, at this company were worried, like if we buy a ton of Bitcoin, like if we buy like really a lot, like that could actually be noticeable to folks. And that would then not only be noticeable perhaps in sort of the broader Bitcoin market, but it could be noticeable in that people think that somehow we're like storing up nuts for the winter kind of thing with Bitcoin, and like it makes you more of a target, right? And so these services that can kind of help you exchange out money, regular currency for Bitcoin, actually have quite an interesting niche that they hold.
This feels like an obvious requirement because of the market dynamics at play, but it also feels like I'm not as much of an economist as I should be, but a market failure if this is what's going on, because ideally you'd have better cybersecurity solutions in place to prevent yourself from ever having to get into this situation. So yeah, what are some of the preventive measures that you would advise beyond the simulation for folks to prevent these bad things from happening?
Well, I mean, the really tough part is that so much of this stuff comes in through phishing attacks to employees, right? And so you can put as much network security as you possibly can, and you can try to block emails that have, payloads, if you will, on there that are recognizable. The challenge is that, hackers are perpetually coming up with different ways to, try to get folks to essentially click on messages and suddenly make their machines very vulnerable. And that's really hard. So, one of the kind of softer sides of cybersecurity that I think people don't necessarily think enough about is actually the employee education side, and helping them not only identify phishing emails, but also, just elevate the awareness so that it's almost like the whole counterterrorism thing. Like if you see something, say something, right? Like you see a suspicious package or whatever, someone leaves it on the bus, like, don't touch it, report it, all that kind of thing. Sort of training people to have kind of similar antennae up for all kinds of things. It could be emails, but it also could be something that pops up on a website that you accidentally click on because we're all in a pandemic and you're really worried about toilet paper or whatever. There are very creative hackers out there that come up with different ways to keep displaying things that look useful, important, maybe even essential, because we saw a lot of this actually during the kind of the beginning of the COVID era, if you will, in kind of March and April, where they'll ride on whatever the issue is of the day that people are going to want to click on, and they're very clever. I got a text message not that long ago, basically saying like, hey, Siobhan, your delivery is, your package is out for delivery, please click on blah, blah, blah. And I was like, there are only a few outlets through which I actually purchase stuff that's delivered. One obviously starts with an A, just like everybody else. And Amazon doesn't communicate with me that way, right? And I also—
I thought you were going to say Applebee's for a second, but—
Could be Applebee's, but no. It was written in such an informal way on purpose, right? That it made it sound like it was, some hip, tech retail outlet or something. And it was like, I didn't click on it. Obviously, I sent it to our IT security people, but I could very much see lots of people clicking on that because it was like I had to resist the impulse. So I was like, what? That doesn't make sense. And then it's like, well, I'm not going to click on that thing. And so, that's just one recent example that, I think many people would be pulled into. And then all of a sudden they're into your phone and, they can wind their way into other things. My understanding from talking to our IT security people is that it's actually much harder to get in through your phone because at least I have an iPhone, and iPhones are a little bit, their security is quite good, and so they can kind of block off the additional entry points and things like that into other stuff. But there are all kinds of ways to get in, and so educating employees to basically always be out on the lookout and give them some examples and keep refreshing their memory about it, I think is a really valuable thing to do, because the statistics on this kind of thing are terrible, but you see things like 80% of these kinds of attacks come in through employees, and I imagine that number is higher now because we're all in this remote work environment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. I think phishing obviously is a sort of tried and true and trusted method that people have used. Poor John Podesta like that's what happened to him. And the humans are always, the individual is always the weakest link when it comes to that. I'm actually guilty of clicking on a phishing email when I worked in the Pentagon. I was working very long hours as a speechwriter. My boss, I had to be in the office at 6 a.m. quite a bit, and then I had to also write speeches the night before, and he would read it at 7. So that meant I was perpetually exhausted. And I got an email. It said it was from USIP. It was a hacker. They'd obviously been tracking the things I'd been reading somehow, or they were just guessing. Like Reiber's probably curious about the Middle East or Asia. And I got a PDF from a nation state, and I was on the phone with someone else, just like clicking through email while I was on the phone, which is a bad practice, right?
But also something everybody does.
Everybody does it. Everybody does it. And I laughed about it because and then the person I was working for at the time was a sub-cabinet official. When I told him I'd been hacked, he was a little bit jealous because he's like, why haven't they targeted me yet? But so I work in technology, and I work for AttackIQ. We test cybersecurity controls. We validate that they work, which is immensely important because 82% of enterprise breaches could have been stopped by existing controls, but weren't, because when they stop working, they don't tell you, right? Now, my prior company worked in security segmentation, which means if you break into a server through a phishing email or through some other means, you can move laterally. And that, in a case of ransomware, that's what the hackers do. They have an embed that gets in, then they can gain access to your most sensitive data, whatever it is, if you're a law firm, on your document management system, and they move laterally throughout the servers to hold it. So you have to have a capability that can prevent people from moving laterally. That's a very important thing. And there are 3 or 4 firms that are doing well in this space. So there's that part of it. And the other thing I say is, like, when you exercise these things, you have to actually make sure that they work, because somebody will click on it eventually, right? Like, that will happen. So there's this comprehensive approach of education. One area I wanted to ask you about is, we've seen a lot under the Corona era. The sort of extraordinary onset of the coronavirus has put this immense downward pressure on all kinds of different institutions. So researchers, it was disclosed by the New York Times, Chinese have been stealing data from vaccine researchers, but then the other one is hospitals. So hospitals are overburdened tremendously. And I wondered if you've worked with any hospital folks. If you haven't, don't worry, but if there's any particular messages that you'd give to folks in the medical community right now.
Well, my concern about the medical community is that, companies that do pharmaceuticals. Now, one of the interesting things is that we've seen the entry of a number of smaller companies into the pharmaceutical arena, and that actually makes me much more concerned than some of the big ones, because the big ones have been trying to deal with folks trying to steal their intellectual property forever, and so that doesn't mean they have perfect security, but it means they've given it a lot of thought. Some of the smaller ones, they're small startups, they're small companies, maybe they haven't had their big hit yet, and maybe they don't have much of a security budget, so I would be very worried about that. Hospitals also typically just don't spend a lot on cybersecurity. Like, they're all about patients and making sure they serve their patients, and dealing with health insurance and all that kind of stuff.
Particularly right now. I mean,
yeah. And so particularly right now, just like all of us, hospitals have sent a number of their people home to go work there too. I mean, they need doctors there, but they don't necessarily need the IT people all on site. They probably have some, but or far less sort of security-minded people, whoever's doing administrative stuff or business stuff or whatever. A lot of those people are working from home. They're not actually in the physical building. And so again, just like all of us, the remote work element creates additional surface area for attackers to go after. And so, for hospitals that haven't really prioritize security, and there could be any number of good budget reasons for that, they may not have the kind of segmentation that you're talking about. And so someone goes home and they're just logging in, and they click on that phishing email, and the hacker is able to basically impersonate that hospital employee and move laterally throughout the network pretty much unimpeded. Maybe they'll go get administrative credentials or something like that, and just kind of move around. All of a sudden, they get into the guts of the hospital, if you will, because all of this machinery is now connected. They whack the server that is, doing a bunch of ventilators or something, or whatever it is. All of a sudden, you have some real operational impact to your hospital. And so, I think perhaps more likely, if you're talking about a ransomware attack, would be something that's like slightly lower level, where it's noticeable to the hospital, hasn't killed anybody yet, but could if they wanted to go do that. And they say, okay, go give us, $10 million or something. And the hospital's gonna be like, how quick do we pay you?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Because there's an enormous operational impact and lives are literally on the line. And so I am very concerned about hospitals that, maybe haven't historically paid a ton of attention to network security issues. A lot of times we see that, like, frankly, even companies that spend a lot of time on security, it's just that patch that just didn't happen, and a hacker finds it, and all of a sudden they're in. And so you really have to be diligent about all the really basic stuff. And then, you probably need to be on heightened alert for anything that suggests suspicious activity on your network.
Yeah. One of the cases that really blew my mind, this happens all the time with breaches, like something just blows your mind when you think about the horribleness that could happen, was the Sing Health breach a couple years ago. And this is Singapore's health provider. They transitioned over to a new cloud, and this is all public. Actually, they did this amazing thing where their minister of IT security held a public hearing about it and wrote this incredible resource admitting all the mistakes that they made, and then inviting in the world to sort of contribute to try and help them solve the problem. It was remarkable. But so in their transition over to cloud, there was an old server that had not been patched, and the nation state actor, who I believe it was a nation state actor, penetrated in and got all the data from 1.5 or 1.2 million Singaporeans, including the prime minister, right? So they stole the health data. Now you can imagine if they're also doing other kinds of surveillance or using big data in some other way, and they're finding key targets who are in a hospital, like, to the really, really horrible. This is the worst idea I've heard in my own head in a long time. Like, if people are in on a ventilator and it's the prime minister of a country, and they go in and they do that, this is enough to make you want to walk into a hospital right now with a placard and just yell to anyone who will listen, like, please secure your systems, please do it right now, because under Corona, it's like we're more vulnerable. Like, our vulnerability is we are more vulnerable because of the impacts of the disease, but also the socio-political stuff. That's a very dark thought. So let's pivot to something a little more positive. The other area where we're seeing this is obviously states, including Baltimore. Like, the city of Baltimore had suffered from a bad ransomware attack. What are some of the things? Is there any difference in the kinds of advice that you give to CISOs in the states for this issue, or in cybersecurity more differently? And then beyond that point, if you want to, this is probably a good time to pivot towards your upcoming work on disinformation and elections.
Sure. I think that actually the advice is sort of broadly applicable, but I think that in the context of, state budgets and sort of, public institutions and things like that, there's a higher premium on really strong risk management and really strong prioritization, and probably being able to make the case internally, because you're competing with all kinds of budgets, right? You're competing with public schools, you're competing with police, you're competing with, all kinds of really critical services, firefighter, and everything that, obviously that cities would pay for. And so, I think that in that case, what is really critical is for the CISOs or whoever is in charge of technology security in a given city to make sure that they have a seat at the table, that they are making the case, and that they're doing it. And this kind of gets back to some of the communications challenges, because we often work with CISOs to try to explain and make their case a little bit better in English, that sometimes they're just sort of dismissed as like, well, whatever, that's your problem, go deal with the ones and zeros. And so I think that if nothing else, the fact that we've seen a lot of ransomware attacks on cities, whether it's Baltimore, Atlanta, or we're seeing them on court systems, like we're seeing them on lots of public institutions these days, I think that it should start to raise awareness a little bit more that, yes, and that people depend on the city for, lots of different types of services. One way to bring all those services to a screeching halt is to have it locked down under ransomware, right? And so that should elevate cybersecurity a little bit on the priority list, because it becomes a real dependency or limiting function if you don't have your networks to be able to provide 911 service or all these other things that we know are really critical city services.
That's really helpful. So you've now been interacting with the Secretaries of State and their offices through the D3P program for 3 years. Could you tell us what are some of the positive things that you've seen come through this process? And we're now X numbers of days until November. The second question, I suppose, would be, what are the things that you would urge states to do now if they haven't?
Yeah, so for the secretaries of state, I really do think that um, and obviously I've got a limited sample size because it's the ones I'm talking to about cybersecurity, but there's a wide swath of secretaries of state and other election officials, election directors. I mean, it depends a lot from state to state who's really in charge of the elections and who's in charge of election security. But, I would say at this point, the majority of states really have kind of gripped this problem, right? The challenge is that it is sorry?
That's hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, and there has been some DHS funding, probably not enough, all that kind of stuff. Awareness is not an issue. No one's going to question that election security is an important priority for preserving our democratic way of life, right? The challenge becomes the fact that there are, it's by definition sort of a decentralized system, even within a state, right? You have counties, you have precincts, you have like all of these sort of like lower level officials responsible. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but like they're literally sort of down farther on the kind of the regional food chain. That are responsible for administering elections. And as you know, in cybersecurity, it's kind of like you only need to find like the 1 or 2 weak links and then you're in. And the challenge is that because we have such a decentralized system for executing the elections, and there are so many different links in the chain along the way. It's voter registration, it's the power source to the school that people are going to go vote in. It could be now that people are registering for vote by mail online and things like that. That system is obviously dependent on a network, and so to the degree that anyone can infiltrate that, manipulate it, or do anything that basically just undermines people's trust that the system is doing what it's supposed to be doing, can create some real problems. And so that's my concern. It's not that for the most part people aren't doing the right thing. It's just there are so many different small ways that folks can create a real problem, that it's a risk. Now, the flip side is, and the good news, so to speak, is that it takes a lot to mess with an election to truly change the outcome. You just, even if someone hacks into, one particular precinct and is able to change all the votes from R to D or from D to R, right? One, it'll probably be noticed. Maybe they have to be a little bit more careful with that. But, doing that in a few precincts probably is not going to flip an election. The challenge is if you're in some of these states or some of these jurisdictions where it's very, very close and, it could go one direction or it could go the other, then if a hacker is able to sort of do it enough on the margins in enough places, you can create a problem. And even if they can't change the vote, if they start undermining the faith in the outcome, right? Even that's really all they have to do. They don't even have to change anything. They just have to have people question, well, are these really the results? Then you've got a problem. So, from an election standpoint, that's why if you're worried just simply about the security of the vote, having paper backups, having some of these other things that allow you to verify after the fact what the actual votes were and not have it be completely dependent on electronics is really important. But that's not saying that you can't create a lot of problems by simply just messing with voter rolls. So people show up to vote and they're like, no, you're not on here. And then it's a provisional ballot, this, that, and the other thing. And, that kind of chaos can deplete turnout, can do things that, again, on the margins can kind of affect things.
So if, let's assume that you're a state who's done a not insignificant amount of investment, and this will be my last question before I open it. I want to open it up to the group. So for those of us on the chat, you can start sending in your questions now, and my colleague Cooper and I will take a look at them, and we'll ask Siobhan if you have questions. So go ahead and type them in now. Siobhan, for a state that's done a significant amount of investment, that's not starting at zero, which I hope is the majority, and I think is certainly, like the last time I went to a D3P event, there were a lot of secretaries of state there. That was when I first wrote to you, 2017 probably. What would you say to a state who's done a fairly decent job? Like, what would be the sort of top 3 things that you would tell them to do in advance of the election to prepare themselves?
I would I mean, if they don't have a playbook, and D3P, I will say, has put together an awful lot of playbooks and templates that states still could take, and make their own in a reasonably short period of time, and we'd be happy to help. But if they don't have a playbook, or even if they do, go and double check and make sure that everybody who's on that sort of crisis response team list is aware of their roles and responsibilities, that you have backups, that you kind of know who the team is, and they know who what their responsibilities are. So make sure that the team is sort of clear in advance, right? Make sure that you have some key processes defined for how it is that you're going to make certain types of decisions in one of these incidents, because you're going to have to respond quickly, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on and a lot of focus on what you're doing. And I guess the third thing would be, looking at both cybersecurity issues as well as disinformation issues, because if you're talking about concerns around undermining the trust and faith in the democratic process, disinformation can do a really good job of that without ever having to get into anybody's system. You can just find articles, if you will. They may not be real articles, they might be other things, and oftentimes they're even generated by like RT or like foreign, but sometimes they're generated internally too, domestically too. But all people have to do is kind of pick up some of these like fringe conspiracy theory things and start circulating them more widely on the web, and it can start to undermine trust and faith if it's not countered quickly. And so I guess the third thing I would say is think about disinformation and sort of plan accordingly in terms of your disinformation response. Make sure that you're responding to it. Make sure that you know how you're going to report it to the platforms, to others in your state. How are you going to make decisions about how to respond to that as well?
So one of the recommendations that I've come up with, or maybe I picked it up from someone else, is like you have to have a person who's going to be speaking to the public clearly about what's going on, so an appointed person, and they have to be like communicating in advance of the election to gain sort of reputation, so that if something does happen, they go on TV or they go on social media or they release a letter, and they've prepared in advance to be able to say certain things, but they're also comfortable doing so. Is that, I mean, I put a lot of credence in that, because I tend to want to see good leaders out there doing those kinds of things. How much does that factor into your own thinking?
I think it's critically important, and both for trying to reduce the impact of cyber attacks as well as disinformation. And I mean, having the right sort of trusted spokesperson out there certainly isn't going to reduce your cyber risk of being attacked, but what it will do is it'll reduce the impact of it, right? So again, the goal is maintain trust and faith in the system. If you have an individual who is trusted and is going out and saying, look, there was a problem, we're on it, your vote's still going to count, and that they have laid the groundwork in advance, because I think that is a really important point that you made and that people need to think about. That person has already gone out and kind of educated the public and is seen as kind of a go-to source for things, then they're going to have the credibility to say, look, there's an issue, I'm going to level with you, but we're on it, and it's not ultimately going to affect the vote, assuming that's the case, right? You also can't provide reassurances that you wouldn't, stake your job on, if you will. So you've got to be careful, because you've got to maintain that credibility. And the same thing goes for disinformation. Having an individual who is credible, who can counter a disinformation narrative, and frankly, an individual with a lot of friends who are also really credible, who can help them counter that disinformation narrative, is also very helpful. And I joke when I say friends, it's not necessarily friends, it's obviously people who you work with and respect and all of that. But the adjustment I would say is, for countering disinformation, you need one person from your organization, but you also need to be thinking about the validators who can help you counter that narrative, because sometimes being the organization who is, say, the target of a disinformation attack, coming out and saying that's not true is not going to be so credible. But having someone who is maybe typically seen as an adversary to your organization or a partisan in some fashion, coming out and saying, actually, generally, there's not much we agree on, but I got to say, this is actually, this person they're speaking the truth, and having someone, who's able to do that, or some group or set of individuals who can do that, is very valuable.
That's such a fascinating idea. I wonder if there's more to talk about on that, because the obviously the United States is in this moment of it's not quite civil conflict, right? Because a lot of it's happening online, but we are, because of the way the coronavirus has happened, and because of a lot of the pressures internally, socioeconomically and politically, we are vulnerable. And if I'm Vladimir Putin, I'm seeing this and I'm literally rubbing my hands together. And I think the degree to which you can have political opponents in different states who have different views, both of whom should be concerned about not just the integrity of the election, but the stability of the country, coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement and coming out of Corona. This feels like a good patriotic thing for people to do across party lines, and to make it sort of very depolitical, right? Like, we're just going to be here to validate that we're going to try and manage this problem, because we know that the Russian government is going to do this, and other governments potentially. Have you seen states and folks in the states sort of pick up this mantle of building a coterie of validators and like a team to do this kind of crisis management communications?
I have seen states who are trying to think through how they would respond to disinformation campaigns, and I've seen states that understand that that's a component of it. There's not a particular state I can point to as like a great example of it, but that's probably just because I don't happen to know. I imagine that is happening, and I will say that there are, Secretary of State is an elected position. And so there are certainly secretaries of states of both parties who take this very seriously. But it would be ridiculous for me to suggest that somehow this issue isn't one that's become politicized. And I think that actually makes it that much harder for people who are taking it seriously to really go forth and do their work, because it's then seen as just simply addressing this issue as like a political statement. And so that's a problem, right? So if the overall goal is to preserve democracy, that absolutely shouldn't be a partisan issue. But if simply promoting election security is seen as making some sort of political statement, that becomes dissuasive to some people who, I'm not going to say they were on the fence about doing it, but they got a lot of stuff to do. And so how much are you going to prioritize the thing that's going to create a lot of political heat if you go pursue it? How much do you really want to invest in that? And I think that that's an unfortunate sort of political reality that folks across the country are facing, probably at all levels of government.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I got off a call earlier this morning, and there are a number of agency heads who are depolitical people in cybersecurity. I'm thinking in particular of Chris Krebs and Paul Nakasone, and at General Paul Nakasone at NSA and Cyber Command, and people like Ann Neuberger. Like, these are not political people. And the degree to which you can have experts who operate below the political fray contributing to this kind of validation. Now, they're federal officials, so they're not going to be able to do it for every state, but they may be able to chime in when leaders are trying to do this sort of crisis management component. I'm just thinking out loud here about how this could work. It's obviously, yeah.
I think that's true. I think the challenge is whether or not they feel comfortable doing that. And so, one thing that's important to think about with validators is making sure that, regardless of whether they agree with you, would they actually go out and say it? And you've got to be able, you need a group of people who would actually go out and speak to it, ideally publicly, at a minimum to sort of other interested parties, right? But ideally someone who would speak to it publicly, particularly if you're talking about disinformation, because that's already out there in the public. So you need someone who can, who's credible, who has the counter narrative that's accurate, go out and counter it publicly. And I think that's one of the challenges that you'd run into. And so it is a matter of finding people who are not seen as partisan or not seen as invested in some specific political outcome. I don't know how federal officials will necessarily be able to do that, or how many of them. I hope that they could, but there are a lot of competing priorities that they're going to be juggling as well.
Yeah, and not to mention like public affairs clearances and the pressures of their own. But it might be hyperbolic to say, but literally, like, this is the thing we've been preparing for in cybersecurity for 4 years. So part of me says, like, well, if you're not going to do it now, write your resignation letter and then go and do it, because like this is literally the most important thing they could be doing. That's very hyperbolic, and I don't actually mean it. But that's incredibly helpful, and we're all looking forward to the disinformation handbook that you guys are producing. And I'm so, like, when I think about what D3P has done in the last 3 years, it makes me very hopeful. And I've written about this before, saying, look, like it's very hard for CISA to do all the work. It's very hard for DHS. It's very hard for this, for Congress to pass legislation that has a measurable impact because it's expensive and complicated. But if you provide an academic and thoroughly vetted resource that's gone through tech and the secretaries of state and people like you, like this is a great thing. So I want to give you the chance to take a step back, Siobhan, and think about, you've seen a lot of crises up close, and you're thinking about what's going to happen in the next month. What are some if you may have already said this, but what are sort of some of the big lessons you would offer to individuals and companies in this extraordinary time at the management level for how to make a difference?
I think that being prepared to respond, because sadly it's really a not if but when, and I feel like that's so cliched, but it's so incredibly true. And I can't tell you the number of companies that I've talked to where they're like, well, we never thought it was going to happen to us, because sometimes they're teeny tiny companies, and they're already dealing with a lot of different issues, and like, why on earth should they have the world come crashing down for this, right? But all of a sudden their stuff's locked down, or someone stole really sensitive files, and they're in the middle of a real set of problems for their company. So I think that kind of acknowledging that it really could happen to you, and really truly putting together plans for how you would respond, doing that in combination with all the technical mitigation measures so that reduces the chance that it's going to happen, of course. But if there's one thing that I've seen in working with companies in this space, it's how you respond to one of these incidents is almost more important than the incident itself, right? It's bad that it happened, but if you're seen as bumbling the response, especially when at this point everybody's kind of been forewarned that it could be an issue for them, right? If you're seen as bumbling the response, that's when things really go sideways. That's when people lose their jobs. That's when you lose a lot of money. That's when you lose a lot of business, is when it's seen as not being handled well. And so I think that people do need to think about, and I realize I sound a little biased in saying this, but it's based on a number of years now of observation of working closely with companies in these situations, that when you're seen as handling one of these incidents well, and your customers see it and your employees see it, and if it's relevant, the public sees it, you're going to come out okay, and you're going to be fine, and you're going to go through it, because you, as a business, you're going to deal with bumps in the road. Getting caught off guard and bumbling your response is the true damage that you can do to your company. And so, whatever types of things you need to do for your company to prepare, playbooks, simulations, educating your employees, making sure that the tech people and the rest of the business are all lashed up so that they know what they're going to be doing in the event of one of these things. All of those things will definitely put you in a better position to respond effectively and to bounce back, right? To be resilient. That's almost become cliched as well in the cyber arena, but sort of doing the things that you need to do to build the resilience of your company to be able to bounce back and get back to business. And this is true for governments too. Everybody's got to get back to doing whatever they were doing. That's probably the most important thing that you could do.
That's extremely helpful. I mean, I come from an exercise culture in the Defense Department, and planning is how you there's plenty of good quotes out there about the more plans you do, the better you are to survive something. That's great. It's been great having you on. We're all immensely grateful. Like, how many times can I say grateful? I've learned a ton, and thank you for all that you're doing. I hope folks, for all the listeners, I hope you continue to look into what Siobhan has done. A couple of links that she mentioned just as a wrap up, and I'll put these on our website. The Defending Digital Democracy, D3P, is at Harvard through the Belfer Center, and I've got a bunch of links for the playbook she mentioned. CISA, which is the federal agency that manages a lot of helps states manage a lot of their cybersecurity. They also have great resources through other research organizations outside of Harvard, although I've praised Harvard so much I don't want to praise others, but there are a lot of good resources on the CISA website. And the Brunswick group. You should check out Siobhan's writing and follow her work. But again, thank you all Academy students that are here and folks from the public. We appreciate you coming in. We're planning the next round of our guest lectures, but we hope to have Siobhan and her team from Harvard on sometime soon. So thank you again, Siobhan.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Great. Okay. See you soon.
See ya.